Good morning, Bio Honors students. You all yesterday watched films about the first three phyla that we're going to talk about. So phylum Porifera, which are the sponges, phylum Cnidaria, which are the jellies, anemones, and corals, and then phylum Platyhelminthes, which you should have been familiar with before. Those are the flatworms, and we did experiment with those earlier in the year. If you were in first block, we did get through taking some notes on phylum Cnidaria, so you can go ahead and forward through where we were. But third block, we didn't quite get there. So just skip to where you need to go. And so I'm just going to go through some of the notes, and then you guys will have another film to watch. I did get some feedback that it took a little bit longer for the homework yesterday, so I'll try to make that shorter for you today. And then I hope you guys have a good weekend. All right, so phylum Cnidaria, as you saw from the film, these organisms are going to be marine. They're carnivorous. They have tissues, but no real organs. They really only have two tissue layers, the endoderm and the ectoderm. And they have that one-way digestive tract, a gastrovascular cavity. So materials like their food enters the GVC, they digest it as best they can, and any of the undigested material is then just expelled. They have radial symmetry, and they have simple muscle and nerve motion. They have two basic overall body forms, the medusa form, which is the jelly form or the jellyfish form, and then the polyp form, which is more like the anemone, corals, and hydras. So you can see on this slide here the GVC a little bit better, and you can kind of imagine that the polyp and the hydra stage are really just kind of flipped around from each other. And then, of course, everything in this group is carnivorous, so they do use nematocysts to paralyze their prey. So there's a hair trigger that if you touch that trigger, the nematocyst gets deployed, and it's a harpoon-like structure. It then will start pumping toxins into the organism. So some jellies and corals and such do affect us, but most of them do not. And if you've ever touched a sea anemone before, they feel sticky, and they feel sticky because you have to pull away from and break those nematocysts. So the main groups are the jellies, the sea anemones, and the corals. And you have already watched a video about them. So, all right, you also watched a video about phylum Platyhelminthes. So these are the flatworms. And so this includes tapeworms, planarians, and flukes. The common name for this group is just flatworms. So you aren't required to know the to know the Latin names. We'll use the common names as much as possible. So. And you should recognize these guys down in the lower right-hand corner. There's your planaria. So one of the major characteristics of this group is that they are flat. So they have these ribbon-like bodies, and that is great for increasing the surface area. They can be just free-living aquatic, or many of them are parasitic. So obviously tapeworms are parasitic. Flukes are also all parasitic. So the planarians are part of the free-living non-parasitic groups. And they also have bilateral symmetry. So if you cut them right down the center, you get equal left and right halves. This group is the first group where we see the evolution of true organs, and they do have three tissue layers. They have the beginnings of a central nervous system, and they get information from sensory organs that are kind of clustered in their head. So this is the first group that we see where organisms are moving in one direction through their environment. And if you think about it, when you start moving through your environment, you don't want to see what's all around you. You don't want to see what's behind you. You want to see what's coming up. And so the sensory organs kind of move to the front of the organism, and this is the first group where we see a head starting to form. They are acoelomate, meaning they're solid tissue all the way through. They still only have that one opening into their digestive tract, so they have a gastrovascular cavity. And they do have a pharynx where they can stick that out and suck food into the digestive tract. Now, some of the planarians have actually lost their ability to do this. So tapeworms, for example, because they're completely parasitic, they don't really need to have a GVC, so we don't see it in all groups. And you don't have to know class names at all, but the turbularians are all the free-living flatworms. Oops, I went ahead, sorry. The turbularians are all the free-living flatworms. And but there are a lot of marine flatworms also, and they're very beautiful. You did see them in their unusual reproductive behavior in the videos yesterday, so you know that they're also hermaphroditic. Sorry. All right, the next group is Platyhelminthes, or I'm sorry, the Cestota, which are the tapeworms. And tapeworms are parasites of vertebrates, and pretty much all vertebrates can get tapeworms. And of course, you are a vertebrate. But living in Naples, Florida, you don't have any concern about getting tapeworms. But people who live in developing countries do sometimes get tapeworms, and the way that that happens is through fecal transmission. So a person who is infected with tapeworms, if you imagine if they're out taking care of their cows, if they have to go to the bathroom and there's not, running water or anything else, they may just defecate in an area where the cows would later graze. They form cysts in the tissue, the meat, and then if you eat the infected meat raw or undercooked, they can hatch inside of your digestive tract. And then the last group of them are the flukes, and these are all parasites, again, of vertebrates. And the way that you get them is by eating the flesh of other organisms that have the kind of cysts in them. So one that you get in a different way, not by consuming meat, is actually something called schistosomiasis. And 200 million people on the planet live with schistosomiasis. There is a different version of it that people get in the United States, which is not harmful at all. It's called swimmer's itch, and they get it in places where there's a lot of ducks, typically. So some of you may have heard of that before. But in schistosomiasis, what happens is when people are standing in water, oftentimes tending a crop like rice, these larvae will burrow into them, and then the worms actually can live for many, many years inside of the humans, and they cause some kind of long-term damage. All right, the next group are the nematodes, and there's actually not a Shape of Life video to go along with this group, so I just want to tell you a little bit about them. One of my favorite quotes about nematodes actually comes from a biologist named E.O. Wilson, who said that if you took away the mass of the continents, if you took everything away from the continents except for the nematodes, they would still be visible from space. Nematodes are one of the most abundant groups of organisms on our planet, but they're very, very tiny. Most of them are microscopic, and so we don't really notice them that often. So they're commonly called roundworms, and some of you might know them from SpongeBob's episode where they came and ate his house. They have bilateral symmetry. They have muscles that only go lengthwise, and so that means they kind of thrash around, but they can't really crawl like an earthworm does. They have both a mouth and an anus, and that means they have a complete alimentary canal. And after talking about the GVC, this is an important evolutionary adaptation that we see in this group that all the other groups after this share. They live in water and soil, and some of them are parasites, and we'll talk about a few of them. They are pseudocoelomate. That means their digestive tract just kind of flops around in their body. And they have a tough cuticle that surrounds them. And if they are going to grow, they have to go through a molting process. And the sciencey word for molting is ecdysis. So they will shed that outer cuticle. They have sexual reproduction with internal fertilization, meaning that there are males and females, and that their gametes meet inside of usually the female. They are very important decomposers, and ecologically that's their biggest role. But there are a few of them that are parasites, and you don't have to know these, but I just thought I'd introduce you to them. So One of them that's actually very historically important in the South is hookworm. So hookworm, the way that people would acquire hookworm is that the worms would burrow into their feet. They would go through the blood system up to the lungs. A person would actually cough them up into their mouth. Then they would swallow them and they would go into the digestive tract and the small intestine. And if you've ever heard of the stereotype of Southerners just kind of being like slow and lazy, a lot of people believe that that was actually born out of the fact that many, many people in the southern part of the United States were infected with hookworm for a very long time. These worms can spread a long distance in the soil, so until people started digging latrines like 12 feet deep, it was very easy to become infected by them. And some people actually intentionally infect themselves with hookworms to help with allergies. If you want to know more about that, there's a great episode of a podcast called Radiolab called Parasites, if you want to give a listen to that. You maybe have heard that you're not supposed to eat rare pork before, and that's because there's a nematode parasite that sometimes can occur, very, very rarely occurs in the United States, called trichinella. And if you eat it undercooked, it can hatch and start causing problems. Unless you think that I'm trying to make you all vegetarian, you also can get nematodes from unwashed vegetables. Again, not in the United States. This is much more common in developing countries. And then lastly, brace yourself for this one. One of the most common nematode infections in the United States is pinworms. Children oftentimes get these. The eggs are very, very small and they are very hard to get rid of. And so little kids like to put things in their mouths a lot and their fingers in their mouths a lot. And so if you have a kid who's infected that goes to daycare, oftentimes like a pinworm kind of outbreak will happen. The way that they get spread, this is not pleasant, I apologize again, but so the worms live in the digestive tract while the child is sleeping. The female worms will come out and lay eggs right around the anus, and that is very itchy, and so kids will itch that, and then the eggs get stuck on their fingers and under their fingernails. So that's how that gets transmitted. And then I do want to mention filarial worms. That's something that a lot of people in the world actually deal with. So 120 million people in Africa and Asia deal with filarial worms as part of their existence. They're transmitted by the bite of mosquitoes, and these worms actually kind of hang out in the lymphatic system, which is part of our circulatory system, and it can block it, and it causes swellings of legs and sometimes other parts of the body. It's called elephantiasis when it becomes that swollen, but you can see it's very debilitating for people when it's advanced. But I do want you to remember that most nematodes are beneficial, so most of them are not bad for us. It's just a few. All right, I'm going to introduce you to one more phylum, and then you'll watch the video on that, and then you'll be done for today. So the next phylum are the mollusks. So this is phylum Mollusca, and there are lots of mollusks. There are over 110,000 species of mollusks, and in fact, we find more mollusks frequently. They have a digestive tract with 2 openings. They are mostly marine. A few of them are freshwater, and a few of them are terrestrial. And at this point, earlier I would have asked you in class to just give me some examples. So some marine examples would be things, so you want to, like abalone and clams and oysters are all examples of marine ones. Freshwater, there are also freshwater mussels and snails, and then terrestrial, we're talking about snails. They have bilateral symmetry, and they have that true body cavity. And they also now, we're starting to see a circulatory system and a complex nervous system. They have 3 main body areas, and you'll see this in the video too. They have the muscular foot, which is kind of, if you think of an abalone, it's going to be the bottom of the organism. They have the visceral mass, that's where all the guts of the organism are. And then they have a mantle that kind of spreads over the top, and that's what secretes the shell if they have a shell. Not all of them have shells. They have some special adaptations. So the radula is a scraping tongue, and again, you'll see more about that in the video. And then they have gills for breathing in water. That will increase surface area, and that allows them to take in dissolved oxygen from the water. They have what's called an open circulatory system. And so that what that means is they don't have like blood contained in vessels and then fluid around the tissues. They have just one type of fluid. It's called hemolymph, and it just slowly circulates around the organism. We're not going to worry about nephridia. You can skip that. Some of them use a siphon for movement, and I forgot to include the cephalopods at the beginning, so obviously octopi and cuttlefish are in this group also. They reproduce sexually. They have external fertilization, and most of them have separate sexes, but land snails are hermaphroditic. So if you remember before, we said that those snails or that organisms that don't encounter each other very frequently, there's an advantage to being hermaphroditic, and that's true for the land snails. So within this phylum, we do have a few groups, and again, I'm going to mention the names here, but you don't have to know any Latin names. So the gastropods, which are the snails, slugs, abalone, limpets, and nudibranchs. The thing about gastropods, which this literally translates to stomach foots, is they only have like one shell. If they have a shell, they only have one shell. And their visceral mass ends up being right on top of their foot. So that's why they're called gastropoda. The next group are the bivalves. And bivalvia, so bivalvia means quite literally two hinges. And it refers to the fact that they have two shells that are hinged together. So if you think about those types of organisms, those are going to be clams, oysters, scallops, and mussels. And they are going to be filter feeders. So oftentimes they will bury themselves down in the sediment and they're just sucking water through. And then the last group, my favorite group, these are the cephalopods. So these are the squids, octopi, the chambered nautilus, and cuttlefish. These organisms all have an internal mantle. They are the most intelligent invertebrates. Some of them have very well-developed brains, and they have image-forming eyes. They also have chromatophores for changing color and a closed circulatory system. And there are some pictures of some of my favorites. All right, so that leads us through the note-taking part, so you can go ahead and watch the videos, and I hope you all have a wonderful weekend. Take care and be safe.